The Kid Marine Who Died Too Soon. The forgotten story of Dan Bullock and the painful truth behind his desperation to serve. At first glance, no one could quite put their finger on it. The older Marines at An Hoa base in Vietnam noticed the boy in their ranks. Quiet. Almost too quiet. One of his fellow Marines later described him as giving off a little brother vibe. Not immature, not unworthy, just different. Like a kid trying to wear the weight of a grown man's war. His name was Dan Bullock. He was just 15 years old when he was killed in combat on June 7, 1969. But the story of how he got there reveals something far more haunting than his age. It reveals a deeper truth about race, poverty, and the generational scars that pushed a child from North Carolina's cotton fields to a battlefield on the other side of the world, from the sharecroppers south to the promised north. Dan Bullock was born on December 21, 1953 in Goldsboro, North Carolina, a place still wrapped in the legacy of slavery and the grinding poverty of the Jim Crow South. He likely grew up surrounded by whispers of what life used to be like for his grandparents or great-grandparents, people who may have worked those same North Carolina fields as enslaved laborers, later reduced to sharecropping under a different name but the same brutal system. One woman named Bertha, who didn't personally know the Bullock family, remembers what it was like growing up in that same region. Her voice, though distant from Dan's story, echoes the shared experience of black families who lived it. My family were sharecroppers. We didn't own nothing. We worked the land, but we couldn't keep the fruit of it. Everything was segregated. Schools, water fountains, jobs. The men would leave for the north, hoping to find factory work, trying to escape the south. Sometimes they sent for us. Sometimes they didn't. And that's what makes Dan's story even more tragic. His father was part of that wave known as the Great Migration, when millions of black families fled the South between 1910 and 1970. Like so many others, his father relocated to Brooklyn, New York. Whether he left first to find work or to start over away from the oppression of the South isn't fully known. But history strongly suggests he was following a path carved out by millions of black men who could no longer survive in the segregated South. From Montford Point to Vietnam, the legacy of black teen Marines. Dan Bullock wasn't the first black teenager to slip on a Marine Corps uniform and carry the weight of a nation that barely recognized his humanity. Long before Vietnam, another 14-year-old named Lewis Webb made military history, though his story, like Dan's, remains largely forgotten. Lewis Webb was one of the first recruits at Montford Point, a segregated Marine training camp located deep in the swamps of North Carolina. Established in 1942 after President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, an order that finally allowed black men to enlist in the Marine Corps, Montford Point stood as a symbol of both opportunity and oppression. It was an all-black camp, isolated from the white Marines who trained at nearby Camp Lejeune. While white Marines drilled on solid ground with adequate resources, black Marines at Montford Point trained in primitive, swampy conditions, battling not just physical exhaustion, but also the weight of systemic racism. Lewis Webb, at just 14 years old, lied about his age to enlist. Like Dan Bullock, he was driven by something bigger than himself. Maybe it was the promise of earning respect. Maybe it was the desperate need to escape poverty. Or maybe it was the belief that serving his country could change his future. Whatever the reason, Webb joined the ranks of what would become known as the Montford Point Marines, the first black men ever allowed to wear the eagle, globe, and anchor. These men, boys really, fought for a country that trained them in separate camps, housed them in inferior barracks, and denied them equal treatment even while in uniform. Yet they showed up, they served, they paved the way. And decades later, when Dan Bullock stood on the yellow footprints at Paris Island in 1968, he was standing on the shoulders of those very men. Men like Lewis Webb, who had already proven that black teenagers could meet the impossible expectations placed on them, despite being shut out of full citizenship. But by the time Dan reached Vietnam, little had changed. The military had technically desegregated, but the burden carried by young black Marines like Dan remained disproportionately heavy. Where white recruits might have found community or mentorship, Dan was described by fellow Marines as distant, quiet, different. He didn't seem to fit in, as though he was carrying the invisible weight of something none of them could fully understand. A childhood cut short. Dan followed his father to Brooklyn after his mother's passing. But Brooklyn didn't hold the promises the Great Migration often painted. Urban poverty replaced rural poverty. Dan, like many kids of his time, likely watched his family struggle to make ends meet. While other 14-year-olds may have been thinking about baseball, school dances, or simply hanging out with friends, Dan was likely thinking about money, about how to help his family, about how to escape the cycle. It's easy to imagine what that pressure felt like. At 14, most children are just beginning to explore their identities, developing dreams for the future. A girl his age might have been helping her mother in the kitchen, or braiding her sister's hair, blissfully unaware of global politics or war. A boy his age might have been trying out for the basketball team or playing stickball in the street. But for Dan Bullock, childhood was over before it even began. A desperate choice and the strength to see it through. We can only speculate what ran through Dan's mind when he altered his birth certificate. Was it a moment of pride? A moment of fear? Was he just trying to prove he could be the man his family needed? His nephew would later say in an interview that he wanted a summer job. He perhaps knew the limitation of a 14-year-old not having many job opportunities. No one can say for sure, but what's clear is this. It takes a certain kind of strength, born from a certain kind of desperation, to volunteer for war at just 14 years old. Dan didn't just slip through the cracks, he jumped through them, wearing a uniform that was never designed to fit the shoulders of a child. One of his fellow Marines later recalled how Dan didn't really speak much. He didn't cause trouble. He just tried to blend in. He was smaller, quieter, and carried himself like someone trying not to get found out. And in a way, none of them could quite place why he felt different. The unspoken privilege of white youth. This is where the painful contrast lies. While Dan was forging documents to escape poverty and risk his life for a paycheck, many of his white counterparts, especially those from suburban America, had never felt that kind of pressure. They lived in neighborhoods where lawns were mowed, schools were funded, and futures were mapped out with college brochures on the kitchen table. Of course, not every white child grew up rich, but white children did not grow up under legalized racial terrorism. They didn't have to worry about where they could sit on a bus, where they could eat, or whether their skin color would cost them a job, or their life. Dan's choice was born out of economic and racial oppression that most white families never had to face. Even in death, the disgrace of a forgotten soldier. After making the ultimate sacrifice for a country that saw him as little more than expendable, Dan's body was returned home to North Carolina. But the honor that should have followed never came. There was no public outcry, no parades, no media tributes. And perhaps most shamefully, his grave was left unmarked for over 30 years. Let that sink in. The youngest American service member to die in Vietnam was buried without even a headstone to mark his name. No engraved marble, no brass plate, nothing. Just a patch of earth, forgotten by the very nation he gave his life for. It wasn't until the year 2000, more than 3 decades after his death, that television host Sally Jessy Raphael stepped in to correct what the U.S. government never bothered to do. Sally Jessy Raphael, a nationally recognized daytime talk show host known for covering emotional, real-life human interest stories, learned about Dan's forgotten grave through a newspaper article. She was not a veteran. She was not a government official. She had no personal connection to Dan or his family. Yet she was moved enough by the injustice to personally pay for a proper headstone. But here's the haunting truth. It should never have come to that. It should not have taken a daytime television personality to step in where the U.S. military and government had completely failed. Dan Bullock wore the uniform of a United States Marine. He died serving this country. The government owed him dignity, not silence, recognition, not abandonment. Dan's unmarked grave isn't just a forgotten detail of the past. It is a shameful reflection of how America has consistently treated black soldiers, using their bodies on the front lines only to erase them when their sacrifice no longer serves the narrative. The battle buddy who refused to let Dan be forgotten. Dan Bullock's story is more than a tragedy. It's also a story of brotherhood, perseverance, and the fight for recognition that continued long after his death. One of the most touching parts of this journey centers on his Marine Corps battle buddy, Franklin MacArthur, who carried the weight of Dan's memory for decades. After learning about the loss of Dan Bullock in Vietnam, Franklin MacArthur couldn't shake the feeling that he had a responsibility to honor him. That responsibility turned into a personal mission. For 22 long years, Franklin and his wife searched for Dan's family and the location of his grave. When they finally located it, they discovered that Dan had been buried without a headstone for over 31 years. Determined to right this wrong, Franklin began working to give Dan the recognition he deserved. Recognition came from an unexpected place, the Sally Jesse Raphael Show. Sally's head of security, Al Bland, was himself a Marine combat veteran. Deeply moved by Franklin's mission and the story of Dan Bullock, Al took the story to Sally Jesse Raphael with tears in his eyes, urging her to help. Sally agreed without hesitation. Through their support, Dan's grave finally received the proper headstone and recognition that had been missing for decades. What followed was even more remarkable. Franklin organized a tribute that saw over 2,000 Marines and supporters travel from Brooklyn, New York, to Goldsboro, North Carolina, with police escorts through every state. This powerful journey honored Dan Bullock's life and service, ensuring that America would not forget the youngest Marine killed in Vietnam. History may be repeating itself, the modern threat to black service members. As troubling as Dan Bullock's story is, it's even more disturbing to realize that the same barriers he faced are still being rebuilt today, this time not through segregation signs, but through policy rollbacks disguised as fairness. Under the Trump administration, a sweeping move was made to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives across federal agencies, including the U.S. military. DEI programs were designed to address systemic inequalities, recruit talent from historically marginalized communities, and build pathways for Black Americans in fields where they have long been underrepresented, including science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM. One high-profile casualty of this rollback was a major STEM industry partnership aimed at identifying and recruiting Black STEM graduates for leadership tracks in defense and military technology. That program quietly pulled out, citing the administration's ban on so-called divisive race-based initiatives. But the pushback didn't stop there. In a now viral moment, Lieutenant General Michael Langley, the first Black four-star Marine general, nicknamed Fig by his peers, publicly questioned what kind of America he was serving after watching DEI efforts get gutted. Standing as a symbol of what Black excellence in the military looks like, he asked the haunting question, "What country am I in?" And the pattern is painfully familiar. After World War II, Black soldiers returned home hoping to finally claim the American dream they had risked their lives to defend. But the reality was far more bitter. The GI Bill, which promised home loans, education benefits, and job training, was systemically denied to Black veterans through redlining, racist lending practices, and local discrimination. While white soldiers built generational wealth through home ownership and education, Black soldiers were often locked out, forced back into the same poverty they had tried to escape. It's an uncomfortable truth that still echoes today. These new rollbacks under the current administration serve as a chilling reminder of how easy it is to repeat the sins of the past. The fight for equity and recognition is far from over, but it must continue because the cost of silence is too great. A country that praises the heroism of Black soldiers like Dan Bullock, but continues to make it harder for the next generation to access opportunity, leadership, and recognition. It's not just a policy shift. It's a warning sign. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the erasure of Black talent, whether on the battlefield, in the lab, or in the boardroom, never happens overnight. It happens piece by piece, rollback by rollback, until once again, Black Americans find themselves locked out of systems they helped build and defend. Dan Bullock's legacy deserves more than remembrance. It demands vigilance. because the same doors he forced open with his life perhaps are quietly being closed again, and this time the cost might be just as devastating. Scope News acknowledges and thanks all the men and women who have served, past and present, regardless of race, background, or circumstance. Your service matters, your sacrifice matters, and your story deserves to be told. Sources: Scope News tells the truth. Here are the facts. Special thanks to the local coverage by the Jackson Progress Argus, which helped us learn about Dan Bullock's story through the eyes of those who served alongside him. We also leaned on public reporting from Face to Face Africa, vvmf.org, Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, and Wikipedia for historical context. Additional insight came from government archives regarding Executive Order 8802 and the history of the Montford Point Marines. We also referenced public comments and reporting on Lieutenant General Michael Langley, known as FIG, who made headlines for his bold stand on DEI policy rollbacks. We appreciate every source that helped us bring this difficult yet important story to light. Viewer discretion is advised. Legal disclaimer: Scope News presents this content for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. We do not seek to discourage military service or recruitment. We recognize that there are both benefits and challenges associated with serving in the military. Our goal is to highlight overlooked or hidden aspects of Black history, including the uncomfortable truths about the systemic injustices faced by Black service members. Every effort has been made to ensure historical accuracy and to give proper credit to the sources available at the time of publication. We also acknowledge the limitations in image and media licensing that may prevent us from portraying every historical detail with 100% accuracy. Viewer discretion is advised.